For our final panel, we are taking a more non-commercial, or I suppose like non-video gamey approach to interactive and experienced audio design. I am joined today by Troy Innocent, Jacques Foottit, and Paris Buttfield-Addison. A lot of the talks that we've seen over the course of this conference have really looked at applications of particular tools in the setting of like commercially released video games. And now we're going to talk about other weird places where immersive and interactive audio can work. Site-specific work, sound installations, museums, education spaces, and a whole host of others. I can't actually imagine a panel better qualified to speak about that. And it's kind of an area that I'm particularly interested in as I work as a curator at ACME, and I occasionally get to commission this kind of work. I was hoping you could each start out by just generally introducing yourself and either your studios or your practice, whichever feels more appropriate. Jacques, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. G'day, I'm Jacques. My background is in creative technologies, so I have an interest in human-computer interaction and different ways of engaging with content. And I work for a studio called Dot Dot, and we create immersive experiences and out-of-home experiences. Predominantly, we like to do work for galleries and museums and kind of educational-based things. We also do some commercial work for brands and things like that. But the really interesting stuff is in galleries and museums.
Hi, I'm Paris. I co-founded a studio called Secret Lab in Tasmania. We think we're Tasmania's longest running studio at 15 years, but we're not sure because Tasmania likes to hide in corners. We're best known for a game called Night in the Woods, but we split our time about 75% doing video games and 25% doing weird cultural history and art installations and things for museums and stuff like that. We've built all sorts of stuff ranging from like the Play School games for the ABC to museum installations.
Hi, my name is Troy. I started training as a designer and then got into interactive media through that in a strange roundabout way. Ended up deciding to be an artist. And
happens to the best of us.
Exactly. It's not a bad thing. And since then, started to work a lot with universities, and currently am directing a research lab at RMIT University called the Future Play Lab, which really is really focused on urban play, so how we play with and for and in cities. And there's multiple layers to that, and sound comes into a lot.
Yeah, I think we're going to have an opportunity here to get into like a real mix of like site-specific, hyper-local work that can move around. But let's start with Jacques, a project that you worked on a few years ago, Climate Converter at Te Papa, which is kind of where your studio began. Yeah. So we started out actually at an incubator in Te Papa. At that point, we were looking at if it was possible and how you could utilize virtual reality in museums. And so we were doing some experiments around there. But this work is actually a permanent installed exhibit as part of the Tatayo Nature exhibit. And it came about because the museum wanted to explore climate change and how we could respond to climate change in a way that didn't scare people. So they put out a RFP to see if there was a way that we could utilize this space. And so we developed this concept of Climate Converter. And it's a projection map space, so the walls and the floor are all projected, and people are tracked within the space, so it responds to your presence. The walls carry kind of things we can do as a society to combat climate change, and as you take actions in the space, the space changes to become a more kind of balanced environment. And then there's also a couple of plinths where you can make personal pledges.
And when you make a pledge, it kind of folds up into this origami bird and flies onto the wall. And then you can kind of see there's these birds flying around the space, which is kind of representing our combined individual commitments and things like that. Then this one was kind of interesting from a sound perspective in that it utilized, it was like a 4-speaker setup, but being in a museum, we kind of had to consider the surrounding exhibits as well, so it couldn't be too overwhelming, but creating something which felt like when you're inside, that you were in an environment that was changing and dynamic. And in this one particular, one of the things I really liked about it was the moment of from the plinth to the wall when this bird flies onto the wall, the sound connection of hearing the bird fly from overhead to the wall was like what really connected that to make it feel like it was part of the experience and not just a plinth randomly stuck in the space. So that was one of the real highlights for me from this project from an audio perspective.
I'm really interested in hearing more. You said you responded to an RFP. The prompt, climate change but not scary, pretty tricky one conceptually. How technically specific was that call out, and how much detail were you kind of expected to provide?
Initially, it was a fairly high-level concept, so it had to have enough detail that the museum people could understand the idea, which is often a challenge with interactive, is trying to communicate what it is you're trying to do. So it was still at that point fairly broad. I think our initial pitch, the main things which we were putting in was like, let's use this kind of paper aesthetic to make it feel like it's kind of soft and changeable, so it doesn't feel too intimidating and things like that. So it's kind of that level of detail, I would say.
Yeah, it's an interesting museum challenge, is that museums really want to engage with tech, but audiences don't really want to engage with tech. They don't want to, big problem with VR, people don't want to put on a headset or touch a screen, really. Yeah. There's a big sense that they might do something wrong. So I think I like kind of much softer sensibility, and a more tactile one makes a lot of sense there. You mentioned having to sort of balance the audio with some awareness of the exhibition space around it. Were there other kind of unexpected challenges or things that felt specific to working with a cultural institution that came up as the project developed?
I mean, one of the aspects that, I don't know if I'd say it's a challenge, but it is something that can be a bit different, is the educational aspect. So we can't just make things up. We have to make sure that everything that goes in there has some kind of scientific basis to it. So we worked with Museum quite closely and their scientific advisors to make sure that the things that we put into the experience actually scientifically made sense. So from that aspect, that was a bit different. And then the other challenge, which is I kind of find for site-specific works in general, but museums exemplify this, is that you kind of really need to be in the space to do, like, particularly for audio, your final mix. Like, you kind of need to be there at some point to go, okay, this is sounding right in the space. And so that has its kind of set of challenges around it as well.
Paris, I know that your studio worked on a very creatively titled museum game called
The Museum
Game.
That was not our choice of title.
Didactic is fine. Listen, don't make people guess. It's something that I have learnt from working in them.
It's a sore point. We had very creative titles, and then it got renamed by the management of the museum at the very last minute. But
that also sounds very familiar. That's working in museums.
it's fine. We coped.
That was for the National Museum of Australia in Canberra?
Yeah.
Were you approached by them to produce the game? Did you also respond to a call out?
I think we responded to an RFP for that one, yeah. So we got asked to make a pitch for something that met certain requirements about a game that inspired, it was designed for children to tour around the museum in groups and learn about the collection. So the brief was that we had to make a game that encouraged children to think about the links between items in the museum. So like shearing equipment, old shearing equipment from like early days of Australia, and then Indigenous artefacts and things, and they had to come up with some sort of link between that. It was just making them think creatively about what was in there. So we came up with this thing where they're basically operating a weird steampunk-looking machine that has, brass fixtures and wood. It was all on iPads, and they're travelling the museum, collecting images of the artefacts and just finding links between them and then sending them back up to a server and sharing that information with each other. But it had all sorts of weird sounds that we attached to it that we actually described in that response to the RFP, because we came up with this. One of the things that they said in the museum was they wanted the soundscape of the museum to be impacted by the game, which we thought was a really cool thing at the time. And it was not a cool thing in the end because it gave us a lot of headaches. I'll get to that. The RFP specifically asked for something that impacted the soundscape in the museum, and we thought about that. So we thought we'd make a really loud, annoying game. And we did. And that was great, but it ultimately, we had to go through several iterations with the museum during the RFP stage so they understood what we were trying to get at to make this thing that was, a fantastical piece of equipment from the past and the future all simultaneously. We obviously won the RFP, so they liked it, but yeah.
You have some photos of...
oh God, I'm going to have to skip through a bunch of slides to find them, but
we'll
yes,
skip
I do.
around.
Yeah, let's
it's
skip
all right.
around, okay.
A little loosey-goosey
Sorry, this is all your
the
stuff,
afternoon.
Jacques. Yep. Look at this. Okay, here we go. That's not it. That's it. That's what the game looked like. So it was this weird steampunk-looking thing that, unfolded and opened and shut and moved around and made all sorts of horrifying noises. That the museum people absolutely hated. Like, they were furious with us initially, and we had to, at one point, send a couple of people from the museum wandering around the museum with, like, Zoom audio recorders to capture like several hours of like museum ambience to figure out what the museum actually sounded like, so we could fit something in that didn't sound like a horrifying machine had cut through the wall. But we got there. Yeah.
I think communication here and expectations is kind of an interesting thing that you can both speak to. You've worked, both of you, as you said, Paris, 75% commercial games, 25% weird. Your studio skews more in this framework, weird. But I do find that working with a cultural institution, the expectations are, or communication is different. Like, did you find you had to explain more, explain less, explain different?
Yeah, look, the people we worked with are absolutely brilliant people, but they're not game developers, and we were game developers and games people. So we were coming at this from a very, we're going to make this machine horrifyingly engaging. And, these students will not be able to tear themselves away from this iPad you've given them. And they will ingest your collection, absolutely maximum speed, get through everything. They'll totally engage with all the content you have to offer them. And they were like, we just wanted to make them have fun and think about things a little more critically, please. And we got there, and we were having exactly the same idea of what we wanted to get out of this, in that we wanted to make something that made these kids engage with a museum collection that they were maybe a little bit distant from. Because the National Museum has a lot of Australiana, I guess you'd call it. Old Australian stuff from invasion colonial era sort of thing that doesn't necessarily have a lot of relevance to today's life, but is important to understand the context of. And they were having trouble getting kids to engage with that. And we wanted the kids to, charge through this collection and learn about it really fast. So once we kind of met in the middle and realised we were both trying to make something engaging, they were happy with us, even though this was very foreign to them at the time, because this was one of their earliest experiments with doing something that wasn't just a website. And all the interactivity and sound and noises this thing made were very scary to them. And they were a museum is a sanctified place where we must study the artifacts. And we were there with, horrifying mystery box. But they loved it, and that was good. And then, other museums have since come around to the horrifying mystery box concept, like Mona in Hobart has all sorts of weird noises now. That's great. Yeah.
Jacques, did you find that communication is different when working with a commercial client versus a cultural institution?
Yeah, it can be quite different. Our experience with Climate Converter was that the museum was a lot more open to listening to what we were saying. I found commercial clients, a lot of the time, they at least think they know what they want, and can be a little bit more convincing to guide them towards what we think is the right direction. So, and from that perspective, I find that working with a museum is often can be really rewarding partnership where they recognise the expertise you're bringing and you recognise the expertise they're bringing, and when that works well, it can be a really great experience. And I know I certainly enjoyed our conversations with their science advisors and things like that, and learning things about climate change I had never considered before. So,
I feel like the experience we're designing isn't scary, but I still am scared learning all this research. There's just a question here for you, Jacques, on Climate Converter. Are you constantly updating the audio, or do you use any generative techniques?
The audio, so it was essentially installed to be something that was very stable. So it uses, in terms of generative, there's nothing that's like completely generative. It's all previously recorded samples and things like that. The speaker system itself has kind of the environmental sounds, actually kind of ambisonic soundscapes that have been mixed to each individual speaker in the space. And all of that is designed to just be on a very predictable loop. And that basically gets set and then doesn't get touched until like 5 years later, when they come back and go, okay, we want to do some updates. And then it's a big deal to update it, because you have to take the system offline and be in the space and things like that. So it tends to be, I guess, one of the differences with between commercial games is actually there isn't weekly updates or anything like that. It's set it and then don't touch it. Step back and leave it alone. And then if you do want to touch it again, it's like we need to plan out very carefully how this process is going to go to minimize the downtime on the floor of the museum.
I think something that I have certainly learnt working in exhibitions is that people respond extremely unexpectedly in public space to stuff. Like people, something that we joke about at work, we have a games lab, it's a display of interactive games. Every single time we install new games, there is one, at least one, where a child will figure out how to download Fortnite onto that PC or PlayStation. 100. I have a folder in my phone of photos of kids playing Fortnite in our beautiful gallery, and we in AV, like every few months, catch up and we're like, okay, Fortnite again. What are we going to do about it? I wonder if either of you have had experiences of people, particularly like maybe in the month or two after your interactive project sort of first took shape and went public in the gallery. How did people respond? Did they do things that surprised you?
So I would say, like, one of the really nice things about Climate Converter is that the only way that you can interact with it is through, like, essentially blob tracking of the cameras. So there's no like keyboard. There's nothing you can plug anything into. It's just like we can really restrict how you can interact with it, which takes away a whole lot of challenge in that aspect. Having said that, we did still have a period before the exhibition went live where we had a series of user tests to bring people in to try to catch those kind of unexpected interactions, which did change a number of aspects of the interaction. Primarily, I think the biggest one we identified was activating things on the wall, where originally we'd made it a little bit more flexible, and what we realized was that we needed to be a lot more just touch the wall and it will go. But kids are always great to see interesting ways of engaging with the content. So I would say that we saw some really fun ways of kids engaging and running around. On the floor there's like this little kiwi which will walk around and follow you, and the kids would love to chase it around and things like that, as well as just run through and hit every point on the wall as quickly as they can. So it was great to see that level of engagement, but we fortunately didn't have any like problematic interactions in that opening. Yeah.
excellent news.
We did. We had problematic interactive. We didn't think through the technology stack side as well as we should have for something that was deployed to very clever children, and naively assumed that deploying a game based on iPads to a museum would require a fairly minimal security setup. For the server side of stuff, we locked the iPads down. We did not lock the server down. And one of the children started sniffing packets on the network and figured out how the protocol worked, and then flooded all the other children's devices with random stuff. So we very quickly learned that 11-year-olds are very clever. A similar set of experiences also happened. We're not an installation, but a game targeted at children. We built the Play School games, and one of the games is about Humpty's Day, Humpty being the egg-shaped critter from Play School. Now, I say egg-shaped because he's not an egg. He's egg-shaped.
No, say more about that.
We worked with the Play School team at ABC who are very pedantic about how the critters in Play School work. They're not allowed to be moved by anything but a human because they're not magic, stuff like that. Like, children can't see them be moved without a human being involved in some way, which has changed slightly recently if you're watching Play School very carefully. Humpty is not an egg. Humpty is just egg-shaped. But in one of the games we made for them, it's Humpty's birthday, and he has his breakfast, and you can drag out different things from this toolbar of items to feed him. And the kids were obsessed with feeding Humpty eggs in all the playtests. So every single child who played this game tried to crash the game by dragging out 300 different eggs and tapping them. And eventually we had to get the Play School actors, the cast members, to record a bunch of new voice lines for us, Humpty likes eggs, just because we had to have something to play if somebody did all this egg-related behaviour. Because kids were obsessed with eggs. And yeah, the third tiny quick one that's where something went slightly wrong is we built a bunch of in-flight games for Qantas, so stuff to deploy on iPads that they hand out to kids on long-haul flights, and I think we spent literally a year trying to make a game where you could lay out an airport and drag out planes and design a little plane, kind of like Townscaper but for an airport, where you could not possibly put the planes in a position where it looked like they were crashing or on fire, which is very hard, because children are very clever. Qantas did not want to see planes upside down.
Troy, I wonder if this is an opportunity for you to talk a bit about 64 Ways of Being, project that's been in development for 5 years?
Yeah, it's been in development for at least 5 years, because it started around 2018 and of course has been waylaid by the pandemic because it's all about public space. But it started out actually kind of, since we're talking about children, looking at this idea of playable cities that was really, it's kind of transmutated into something else post-pandemic. It's become much more serious, which I think is a good thing. But pre-pandemic, it was very much about, getting people to play in cities, which is a really interesting concept, and that's the central kind of focus of our research lab. But the approach that a lot of people were taking was, in my opinion, quite problematic, because they were essentially looking at just trying to kind of co-opt how children play and impose that on adults. And then adults are kind of like, well, that's not how I play, for one thing, and also I feel stupid, and, it feels really contrived. And so we were trying to look at ways to, well, first of all, how do adults engage playfully with public spaces? I mean, we know some of them because it's because they're really overt and physical, and that's the kind of where just people kind of performing publicly. But what I'm more interested in, and what 64 Ways is more interested in, is kind of introspective, imaginative play. So the kind of play that you do on your in your lounge room when you're playing a console game, when you're projecting yourself into a virtual world and imagining yourself as this character, as this kind of exploring this space and kind of letting go of reality and saying, oh, this could be something else, but trying to do that, but out there. So because starting with the premise that, of course, cities themselves have a multiplicity to them, so that every city has multiple cultural identities. There's kind of multiple kind of communities that engage with that city. It's shaped by multiple what we call social imaginaries about what a city can be. Certainly, I mean, that's not the mainstream view. I think again, post-pandemic that's starting to change. You know, because there was this kind of, you know, decentering of the city of Melbourne, for example, where it's, you know, kind of, oh, it could be something else, whereas previously, oh no, it must be this, and you know, so the 64 Ways kind of started in that complex space, and what we've tried to do is just distill it into an experience, and the way that we have looked at that is through two real main strategies, both using just a regular mobile phone, but using augmented reality, and also through immersive audio, and combining those two things.
So Paris has spoken a little bit about the difficulty of keeping people doing what you hope that they will do on a device that is connected to the internet and to other things. Is that something that kind of you were conscious of when designing 64 Ways? That you can do anything on your phone?
Yeah. I mean, we really made this project probably incredibly difficult for ourselves, because first we're pushing against the kind of, I guess, accepted norms of playable cities, but second, we're asking people to do something with their mobile phones, which is the opposite of what they do with their mobile phones, which is usually it's a site of distraction, and, you know, kind of jumping from one thing to the next, and if you're using it to get to some place, you kind of doing that while, you know, messaging a friend, while, you know, kind of posting to Instagram, while, you know, doing, and what we're asking people to do is to do what you do when you sit down to play a console game, which is to absorb yourself 100% in that experience. And so we ask, you know, I mean, there's a few kind of you know, say, oh, you know, you're kind of inviting you to be an avatar. It's kind of like a walking simulator, except you're actually walking, and you're an avatar, and you're your own avatar. So it's all these meta things going on. So we don't actually say that to a lot of players, because that's too much of a kind of games reference. But more it's about what we do, and what the way that I brought this project into being was to collaborate with a live theatre group called One Step at a Time Like This, who are used to this type of, I guess, staging a show in public space. And so that's really the invitation to the player, is that it's like you're going to the theatre. I don't think anyone does this, but we ask people to put their phone on Do Not Disturb. We ask them to put headphones on. We ask them to, we situate them in a particular place. So that, for example, the journey that's launching this week starts in Collingwood Yards, and so there's a listening experience that goes, you know, between 5 to 10 minutes, that situates you, that kind of like stops you, that brings you, like centres you on at the start point, and so takes you into that flow, and to go into the show, go into the journey, and so forth. I can grab the control. I'll show a picture of what happens right at the start, which is this is the first encounter that happens following Collingwood Yards, which is with a piece of infrastructure. So we also have these situations where we're inviting people to interact with parts of the city. So in this case, it's a sign that's musical. So as you encounter this sign, which is in a laneway just at Collingwood Yards, you're able to play it like a musical instrument. You know, it's very, very rudimentary, but it responds and kind of sings back to you. So there's this kind of like call and response that happens. And so those types of encounters, those are the ways in which we key people into, I guess, another way of being in public space.
Yeah, I was going to ask, again, because it's something I'm very conscious of in museum spaces, is people really don't like to feel observed doing things. Even if you just put like a video work on a screen, people start to feel self-conscious if they stand in front of it for a while, because they feel like people are watching them watch the work. It gets even harder with interactive work. I was wondering if you had other techniques or other kind of strategies that you've employed in terms of design to try and combat some of that self-consciousness in 64 Ways.
Yeah, you're right. That is a real challenge, and of course, we're asking people to work We're working with a number of technologies that aren't yet as reliable as I'd like them to be. Phone-based augmented reality is still super glitchy and problematic, and the types of techniques that we're using to connect audio to places, geofences and GPS coordinates, are still a bit floaty, and so getting that confidence into people to feel like, I am mastering this, and I am in this, and I am able to engage with this in a meaningful way. It is a real challenge. So of course, if you go back to 2019, 2020, where we were forming lots of the ideas, I mean, some of those still are unrealised as concepts, because you just have to kind of pull them back to make them accessible. But what we do have control over is the curation, and so with each of these journeys, they're very much there's a huge process in researching and walking and finding locations that I do with One Step. So there's 3 people in One Step. The 4 of us kind of go out walking and exploring locations, and they, having a theatre background, are looking for places where that type of action can happen, but in a way in which it feels safe. So they're looking for places that feel enclosed, for example. And in Collingwood Fitzroy, it was really interesting because not only are there a lot of audio journeys already situated there, places like Smith Street and Gertrude Street and so forth, they're kind of super overt public spaces, and there's already so much action going on. So we decided actually in this space to go into a series of byways and back streets that are kind of almost residential, that are secret. And so with this, we worked with the theme of a labyrinth. And so essentially, this is the key. You then kind of move into these spaces and start to encounter layers of language. So this is a laneway just off Johnston Street, but it's kind of just far away to be, you feel like you're on your own, you're secluded, you're in this kind of space of your own. And that moves through, and the kind of content that you encounter is a mix of it has this soundtrack that is immersive and that leads people through space. So in this particular journey, for example, a lot of the music is by Corinne, and her music is very immersive. It takes you into another world, and so that really is there's elements.
Is this Corinne who just released Lux Eterna?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Beautiful artist.
Yeah, and often, so this is showing how long ago we developed this, because it's been delayed by COVID. I think Corinne was living in Melbourne at the time, so now no longer. But at the time, this music was made in Melbourne, and it's really keyed into that place. And so that's how we try to kind of get people to feel that they're in another world, that they're kind of immersed in this experience, that they have some agency in this experience, but they're also being led, and there's that balance between, it's like a RPG design, right? You're taking people through a fixed story, but trying to give them some sense of agency, but at the same time, you're getting them to follow a fixed path.
And it sounds like you're leaning a little bit into the kind of sense that people will have a relationship with Melbourne as a physical space already, and have like an emotional relationship with that space. So they'll kind of relate to the idea of like ducking into a laneway as like a bit of a private, personal thing.
Yeah. Certainly, it's playing off all of the tropes of the city.
Yeah.
I mean, it's playing off the character of the city, and I drawing that out. But at the same time, trying to, so each of these different ways of being, I won't go into the kind of whole research kind of behind this, but they're all keyed into a word from a different language. And so they also are talking about literally these different ways of being. So it's talking not only about that kind of urban culture of Melbourne, but also the multicultural identity of Melbourne, and how all of these different words and ideas are kind of saturated and embedded in those streets.
Jacques, I wondered I was thinking of Pilgrim as we were talking about 64 ways of being, particularly in terms of that, I suppose, sense of potential self-consciousness that you can have with any kind of interactive work that's designed for a public or semi-public space. And I wondered if you could speak to that project a little.
Yeah, I'm just going to have to go back to the start. But so Pilgrim was a work which we did with we were approached by a BBC journalist who'd walked the Camino de Santiago, which is a very long hiking trip. And usually when people do it, they're processing some significant event in their life. And so they'd recorded all of these very long, deep stories and wanted to present them as though you were walking like this little miniature pilgrimage and could hear them walking with you. So this was done for a like film festival conference. So it was a site-specific work that had a route mapped out that we could program the devices to follow. And there was, I think, a few things that helped with the kind of self-conscious aspect of it. One was because this was part of a festival, there was kind of this other people around doing things, and there was already this kind of okayness with experiencing these interactive works. It was also one which utilised these Bose glasses, so you're just wearing these sunnies with the speakers built into the frames, and the phone, while the screen did display something, was not the primary mode of the experience. So you could kind of just hold the phone and walk normally with the glasses and just look like you're walking around the block. So I think that also helped with feeling a little bit like you're not standing out as much. So that was definitely a useful aspect for not feeling self-conscious with that particular work. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Do you, when designing audio tours, which I know you've done for the Port Arthur Historic Site, a phrase that I could not say correctly all afternoon for some reason, was that something that you encountered, or do you think audio tours, kind of straight audio tours, are kind of more understood?
Look, every audio tour we've ever done was originally intended just to be a really straightforward audio tour, and then it ended up morphing into some sort of weird interactive game / experience, because that tends to be what we do. So I think originally the Port Arthur thing was just intended to be an audio tour, and then it turned into this really deeply personal experience for whoever was doing it. Because Port Arthur's had a lot of horrible things happen there, both in the modern era and in the long distant past, and it's kind of a complicated place that people have a lot of different relationships to, so you can't really define the relationship whoever's listening is going to have with whatever you're putting in their ears, so you have to kind of let them do it in their own pace. So there's a lot of different ways to take that content. So we made it the geolocation component optional, so you could turn it on and you could let it guide you. You could turn it off. You could activate it by tapping a thing in a room, depending on where you were. You could not activate it at all and choose to summon it when you wanted. There was a whole lot of ways, because where we tested it, we found people wanted to consume these really sad stories from all sorts of different eras in a variety of different ways, and we had to account for that. So, yeah.
Was that something that came up during development, or was that something you were expecting from the outset?
We were kind of expecting it, but I won't pretend we knew it would happen. Once we did a bunch of tests with the very bare bones sort of audio recordings that we had initially, we figured out that people wanted to consume this site in very different ways, and we couldn't just give them an audio tour because they wouldn't have used it or wouldn't have enjoyed it, or it would have been really confronting and weird for them.
That makes sense. That, I imagine, speaks to some elements of 64 Ways, because I know it's like a long-term collaboration with Auntie Carolyn Briggs. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, this is really super interesting, is once you go out into public space, we don't know what that... People don't have all these different expectations about what that space is. Some people are, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I've done an audio tour before, so that should be educational. It should be like going to a museum. Or, no, I've done this. I've been to some kind of art festival. It should be like a theatre experience. Or, no, I played Pokemon Go. It should be like a game. You know, there's like... it's a really... a super interesting space to work with, but also it's not like a museum or some other context that has, you walk through a threshold and you know what you're in for. So the app has to kind of do some of that work. And so that's where there's so many reasons why it is super interesting to collaborate with Auntie Carolyn. We started in the first journey, which was based in the Melbourne CBD, to interview and to work with a number of First Nations people, both Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung, to contextualise the language, but also to talk about the Burrurung, because that's where that journey ends up. It starts on the steps of Parliament, and it flows all the way down through the city, down to the river. This is a bit of a spoiler, but to Queensbridge, which is where the river used to have a division, a waterfall, but kind of separating salt and fresh water. And so a lot of people know that story, but working with Ngawi Carolyn Briggs, all of these other layers came out of it, came out about the history of Melbourne, which is something I didn't know, which was that it was the largest wetlands in Australia. And so this whole space, from St Kilda all the way, well, pretty much up to here, was a lush kind of changing landscape. And of course the Burrurung was central to that, but even now there are all of these waterways moving underneath the city. So Elizabeth Street is the best example of this, where until they upgraded all of the stormwater drains, it used to regularly flood because that was once a creek. So bringing
one of the main tributaries into the Burrurung.
Exactly.
Elizabeth Street.
Yeah.
Just pave over it, no big deal.
That's right. Yeah, just make it a major road and put a tram over it. All good. Yeah, and of course the other major theme that comes out when you're talking with Auntie Carolyn is that her own identity as being both a custodian and a citizen, because she lives in Melbourne. She's lived in Melbourne most of her life, so she has this dual identity, both as a traditional custodian, but also as a citizen. Her family grew up here. Her whole life is here, and so sharing those types, I guess, contextualising Indigenous knowledge in an urban context is really what she's focused on, which this is going way back. Things have changed a lot since kind of 10 years ago, although where although some people kind of might still hold this view that Indigenous knowledge is kind of out there. It's something that's separate to us. It's out there in the desert or in the forest or something like that. But kind of seeing this history of place as this kind of huge wetlands and how that is still active, and of course reconnecting language and this kind of living culture back to that place became a huge part of the story, and so threaded throughout the Melbourne CBD story are fragments of her knowledge that she's been very, very generous to share with us and to make part of the experience.
It must have been just like a profound experience, like collaborating for so long with someone with such deep knowledge and understanding of place. Must have been a really profound experience for you. Yeah.
I mean, it is. Everyone on the team has been, because she's been so generous for one thing, but everyone on the team has really been. Their kind of perception of, which is what this project is all about, the perception of what the city is or where it came from, and also what it can be, has been profoundly shifted by that. I mean, so there's some really, it's because a lot of the ideas that you hear about become lived experience. So something that we hear often, because it's an important truth to the place that we live on, is that sovereignty was never ceded. And it's like, okay, all right, that's interesting. What does that mean? And so my gamer mind is, oh, that's super interesting. Like we're living in two worlds at once. It's Australia is this, and then there's actually the cooler nation, and so we can but then. To actually talk with someone who is living that experience every day is just mind-blowing, because that's not only like a kind of a fictional kind of scenario, or rather I should say speculative scenario. It's her lived experience, and it just kind of shapes. So particularly going through the pandemic and kind of thinking about, well, this city could be this city could be that, the future could be this, the future could be that. There's all of these possibilities. For me personally, the worldview is just profoundly shifted. It's kind of of course, there's a lot of trauma coming from the pandemic, but also this possibility of, well, the world doesn't have to be that way. It could be something else. And not only that, it actually already is something else. And there are people who have that lived experience every day.
I would love to hear from you, Jacques and Paris, just a little bit more about working outside of the kind of commercial video game sphere. Like Paris, you said, video games 75% of the time, but weird 25%. What's so important to you about making sure you're doing some of that weird? What does it give you?
Oh, look, I lose all grasp on reality if I don't stop making video games, traditional video games at some point, and do something slightly more, I guess, culturally, intersectional, culturally connected, I don't know, name it what you will. I find the video games industry a little bit too tightly coupled with the technology industry sometimes, so I'd like to step away from that a little bit and do something more associated with cultural and arts institutions and things like that, just because it gives us some breathing room to actually think about what we're doing in a much freer way than what a publisher thinks or what gamers want or some other horrible metric. Yeah, so it's much more freeing to collaborate with a weird museum curator, an archaeologist or something like that on a project that helps somebody interpret a site or a location. And the metrics are weirdly similar to video games in terms of how you engage people with it, but also very different. And that really is good for my brain, it seems.
Yeah, I think there's probably two aspects to doing non-commercial, particularly working with museums, that really appeals to me. One is the educational aspect, which is as much about the fascination of learning about a very varied range of content based on the experience you're creating. I really love when we get the opportunity to meet with someone who's specialised in this particular area of science or other educational aspect to share what they're passionate about. And it can just be really fascinating to be learning that. The other aspect of it, which is kind of more general for site-specific or installed works, is the kind of freedom that you can get when you have control over the hardware. It's really great when you can look at something and go, I really want to do this, but the only way we can make this work is if the person uses this particular piece of hardware. Yeah. And when you're in an install, you can go, well, that's fine. We'll just give them that piece of hardware and then we know that they've got it. And so it allows you to do things that you can't do in a context, in a traditional gaming context. And allows you to experiment a lot more with other ways of engaging with content, which is something which I'm quite passionate about, is different ways of interacting with content.
We've got some practical questions here that I thought we could close out the panel with. The first here is, how do you find opportunities for interactive installations? You talked about RFPs, but where do you find them?
Oh, they're everywhere if you look. That's probably a really unhelpful answer, but there's lots of government-hosted RFP sites, and every institution has a page hidden away somewhere. But often if you just email institutions and ask to be added to their list for RFPs, you will get all sorts of weird emails. That's totally worth doing, even if you never intend to or don't really have the time to do it right now, because people like sending packages of things out to people. And honestly, most of the institutions that use an RFP-based process or an RFQ-based process often prefer having a diversity of people in their pool to talk to, because it gives them, good justification for the one they do pick, or gives them a broader range of talent to pick from. So literally just search the internet for RFPs, cultural institutions, museums, stuff like that, because they're everywhere. Like, they're not hiding. They're just not necessarily, often not phrased as like, we want a video game or we want a sound designer. They're often phrased slightly weirdly, so you kind of have to like read between the lines to figure out what they're actually asking for. But, you know, installations, things like that, they use words like that. That means a video game if you want it to mean a video game.
Yeah, I think it also depends a little bit on the scope of the project. Something like Climate Converter, it was an RFP process, but it was quite an involved RFP process because it was a very large budget and part of a permanent install. So that kind of thing, even then, like, the reason that we were able to get into that was because we had a previous relationship with the museum through the incubator program, and so they kind of knew us well enough to know we could deliver. But there's also like smaller things, I think, like art festivals. I know that some of our early work was working with the Museum of Transport and Technology in New Zealand that would do a annual kind of light exhibit and would just put out for general pictures from artists and things like that, which is much smaller budgets and more kind of passion projects, but gave you ways to engage with the museum sector in a smaller capacity. So those kinds of things are also, I think, valuable opportunities to both have some experience putting these things together and meeting people from the museum sector.
I think that's so true. I would really, really encourage anyone who's interested in kind of a creative sound installation sort of work to apply to Rising, to Next Wave Festival in Melbourne. Even I would just email like Emerging Writers Festival or other like local arts festivals just to see what they're up to in the next few years, because in so many cases building those relationships can I've talked a lot about building relationships, but it really is key, and it's key in the arts as well. Building those relationships will like reveal more opportunities to you.
One thing.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'd also say be prepared to do some translation work because so we work a lot with local government and sometimes your mileage kind of is hugely variable. So explaining something like this as being kind of urban play and something that is playful and this immersive sound experience, with they might be thinking kind of like fun in the park or something like that. So
Yes.
the cultural currency of what play is hugely variable. Yes.
That's extremely true.
A lot of local governments, a lot of city councils have like $10,000, $20,000 budgets for small public art commissions that they're often quite willing to spend on weird things that make noises and display pictures on public screens and things like that. So,
I mean, actually, the City of Melbourne's quick response grants are open now. They closed today, I think, which is kind of rude of me to bring up.
Quick.
But it's a really short application. It's like 500-word project description and a simple budget. You can totally do it. Smash one out. And it's like $4,000 for a project.
and if you live regionally, there's lots of regional arts funds floating around.
Yeah. I would also say, like, outside of like RFPs, don't be afraid to like email institutions if you have a work or you have an idea, to see if they're interested in it. Curators love getting emails like that. I know because I am one and I love getting emails like that. I've said to a couple of people this weekend that, at ACME, our like Mordant Family Art Commission is open at the moment. It's for artists who are under 35, who are developing a screen or sound-based work. It's to be installed in our smaller gallery space in 2025. That's something that you can, that's something that maybe you wouldn't necessarily think, I could make a thing for that, but you can make a thing for that. And you, as well as kind of signing up for newsletters and things like that, reaching out directly to curators and saying like, I've got a cool idea, I want to put it in your gallery. It's very unlikely that they'll be able to go like, great, next 3 months, like let's go. but they might be able to say like, oh, well, actually there are these opportunities opening up, or, you know, this thing is happening in the next year or so, or I'll put you in touch with XYZ. Yeah, talk to people, it's my advice. I think this is an interesting one as well, knowing that I'm pretty sure none of you are musicians first.
No.
So what would your advice be for composers looking to get into sound design and music for installations? Maybe you can speak a bit to your relationship with Corinne and how you two met.
Yeah, sure. So, one step brought Corinne onto the project, actually. So, because their approach is really to curate each journey with music that comes from place, and so therefore, maybe I could talk to an artist that I worked with more closely, Alison Walker, where it was really a matter of, you know, I guess listening. And just reaching out and saying, hey, you know, do you want to do this weird game project? And then having, you know, like figuring out how to explain that and you know, building a relationship over time. But certainly, I mean, that's not really advice, is it? It's just there's so much fantastic experimental work happening in Melbourne across all of the art forms. I think games is really a really good connector for these different platforms, or at least that's the way I see it. It's not always the way that it happens, which is why I would encourage, you know, I guess musicians to put up that, even if they think that, oh, my music's not going to work in a game, there's probably a game somewhere that it's going to work really well in. So kind of being part of those kind of intersectional kind of communities, I find is super important. And I mean, my practice has always been influenced by musicians, so I'm drawn to them, and so I don't feel like any of this has been useful advice, but, you know, maybe it
Get
has.
amongst it,
Get
in
amongst
summary.
Yeah, look, get amongst it, but I think that if you're a musician that clearly is showing themselves off on like their website, their portfolio, as somebody who understands like the context of sound in a room, in a place, in a location, in a physical location, that's a really helpful thing, because it shows me that you understand, you know, how sound is made in different locations, how it sounds in a room, how it sounds in a cave, how it sounds, you know, listening on headphones in the middle of a street. And there's a lot of great game composers and sound designers out there who just have like a playlist of tracks and not any like imagery of their stuff being played in situ, and it's really helpful to understand that you understand spaces and how that affects the sounds you're making. And like you do, every sound person does understand that, but a lot of people just put up a list of tracks and be done with it, and sort of don't show their work in context. You don't have to be a performer, you don't have to really put yourself out there too much, but showing that you can make something that is played in a physical space is really helpful to knowing that you're going to be a good choice to work on an installation type project.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I think it's been mentioned multiple times in multiple different contexts about networking, meeting people. That's always important. I know from our perspective, when we've worked with sound designers, it's often also been an aspect of, we know the kind of sound that they tend to like to do and know that that will fit with this project. So kind of having a niche or something like a style that you're passionate about and kind of developing that and being confident with that, I think can be useful to match up to a project.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like one of the sound designers we've worked with a number of times in museum projects has a practice of recording a lot of nature sounds and like going out and getting bird calls and integrating that into a lot of his work, not just the museum work, but so that's something which we see and go, oh yeah, that will fit with this nature project. But, yeah.
I think these are kind of the key takeaways that I've like noticed from highscore in general this year. Don't be afraid to specialise. Talk to people, look after people, they'll look after you. You can just email anyone. You can just straight up email anyone at any time, and that's dangerous, but true.
Yeah. It's also, I would say, not necessarily like if you don't get an immediate job out of it, then it doesn't mean that it failed. Because we will maintain a list. We'll go, oh, that person who emailed us like a year ago had an interesting thing that we think could fit with this project. Let's see if they're still looking.
The number of conversations I've had with other curators, and I've been on the other side of this as like an artist pitching or an artist getting in contact with an institution, but the number of conversations we've had in our curatorial team about projects that we've talked about, or like about pitches that we've talked about for months and then like talked about for weeks, and then a few months later realised that nobody's replied properly to the email itself and been like, oh, didn't anyone get back to that? God, sorry, like we didn't truly email anyone. Don't take a lack of reply personally or as a failure, I suppose would be the addendum to that, because these things take time, and also takes a while for connections to grow and cogs to turn.
Yeah, and also recognise different disciplinary constraints and opportunities. I mean, so thinking of, just coming back to my perspective as a visual artist working with musicians, visual artists can be very individualistic and egocentric and not that collaborative, whereas musicians, very, very different. So different types of collaborations can happen. So kind of recognise the strengths of your discipline and where you fit into, and if musicians fit centrally in games. I think it's taken a while for music to be recognised as being kind of equal to visuals in games, but I guess that's what this event's all about, but I'm glad that it has been.
Yeah, one other piece of advice I'd give is if you can demonstrate any history of like interdisciplinary collaboration of any kind, even if it isn't working on a sound installation, it's working with another artist or practitioner in a different medium, and you can demonstrate that you've done that successfully and not torn each other to shreds. Great, it's going to get you a long way. I think we have reached time. This is our last panel of In the Loft. It has been an absolute pleasure to host. Please give these lovely three a hand.